And I'm gathered here today by several members of the Armed Services Committee to discuss our belief that a careful and comprehensive plan is needed for dealing with the law of war detention for terrorists. While we're not going to detain our way out of the threats we face, law of war detention is a critical tool necessary to neutralize terrorists and obtain valuable intelligence. Previously, in President Obama's speech at the National Archives in May of 2009, he made a commitment to come together and create a path forward with Congress. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Instead, the White House did exactly the opposite yesterday by emphasizing executive authority and leveling significant criticism toward Congress and calling our actions dangerous. We've seen this show before. What I believe is dangerous are terrorists who wish to harm the United States. We have serious concerns about the substance of President Obama's executive sanction order creating a new review procedure for the Guantanamo detainees. Mr. Rooney will discuss these concerns in further detail. Yesterday, President Obama also announced the resumption of military commissions at Guantanamo. This is an important step toward moving forward with a law of war focus instead of prioritizing law enforcement. However, notably absent yesterday was any reference to the disposition of the 9/11 case. Tomorrow, or shortly, we will be introducing legislation to deal with the most significant problems raised by the executive order and other detainee-related issues. In the days ahead, we're going to be working closely with Ranking Member Smith and other Republican and Democratic members to make this a bipartisan fix. My colleagues are going to talk about various aspects of the legislation that we'll be introducing shortly and the concerns we share. Then we'll take some questions. First, we'll hear from Mr. Thornberry, then Mr. Forbes, Mr. Wittman, Mr. Rooney, Mr. Schilling, and Mr. Griffin. Mr. Thornberry.
Mac Thornberry from the 13th District of Texas. Our view is that the time has come to deal with a lot of these issues straight on, not put a Band-Aid over it, not give a wink and a nod and do one thing and say another, but to deal with them head on. One of those issues is the authorization for the use of force, which, as you'll recall, was passed by Congress in September 2001 and really focused on those who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So part of what this bill does is to recognize that the world has changed some in the last 10 years, that as we have put more pressure on Al-Qaeda Central, then various offshoots and affiliates have sprouted out in various places around the world. And this bill makes it clear that we are engaged in a continuing armed conflict and that the President is authorized to detain those who are a part of or supporting Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces engaged in hostilities against the United States. Now, this approach is along the lines that both the Bush and Obama administration have actually been pursuing. This approach is along the lines of the D.C. Circuit Court opinions, but we think it's important to put it into law and make it clear, and that's what this legislation will do.
I'm Randy Forbes from Virginia's 4th Congressional District. As the chairman and Mr. Thornberry both said, this piece of legislation is important because it's time that we move on. One of the things the executive order that the President has issued shows us is the difficulty we have when we introduce politics into national security. And also, it showed us the importance of having a consistency when we're dealing with the Guantanamo issue. One of the things we need to remember is when the President issued his first executive order, it didn't just delay this action so that we could think about it and contemplate it, but one of the serious effects it had was if you went down to Guantanamo and talked to the chief prosecutor, he had assembled one of the best teams this country had ever seen to prosecute the worst terrorists that had ever hit the United States, the defendants in the 9/11 terrorist attack. That prosecutor told us and would have told the President, would have told Mr. Holder, that he had been working for over 18 months, gone through 50-some different motions and hearings in court, and would have had guilty pleas, according to him, from all of the defendants within 6 months. That order that was issued in January, before anyone even went down and inspected the situation, not only stopped the prosecution, but it dismantled all of the teams that had been put together. It dismantled all of the motions that had taken place, all of the prosecution that had taken place since that time. So not only did we lose 18 months of prosecuting the worst terrorist this country had ever seen, but we've now been delayed from that time to today with no decision. We think it's important that we have this piece of legislation to send a clear message to the administration and to terrorists across the world that we are going to prosecute these matters. We're going to prosecute them efficiently, and it's time that we move on and get that job done.
I'm Rob Wittman, representing Virginia's 1st District, and in addition to some of the concerns that you've heard here, there are a number of concerns about the threats that detainees place when they're either transferred to another country or proposed to be transferred to places here in the United States. And we know that we are dealing with new and emerging threats with terrorists around the world, but the concern is, how are we dealing with the transfer of our current detainees? And our legislation would prohibit those detainees from being transferred to the United States, would put that actually in law, but also what it would do is to permanently limit transfers to other countries exclusive of the security issues that those countries can demonstrate that they would put in place if they were to receive those detainees. We want to make sure those detainees don't end up back in the battlefield. And that's some of the concerns as you look at recidivism there and how we're dealing with that issue. This would clearly define, how do we address that? How do we make sure that those countries that we might have agreements with to transfer those detainees aren't places where they could re-enter efforts of terrorism or re-enter the battlefield? Those are things that are significantly being addressed by this bill, and ultimately our goal is to ensure the safety and security of our constituents, the American people, and we believe firmly that this will put into law the ability for us to be able to address those issues of security with detainees in their movement, whether it's here in the United States or to other countries abroad.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Rooney from Florida's 16th District, also a former member of the Army JAG Corps, although I don't speak for the Army. I speak as a member of the Armed Services Committee in favor of this legislation. As Chairman McKeon referenced in his opening, I want to touch on just a few of the points that there may be cause for concern for those of us that are signatories of this legislation as of now. The first is with regard to the habeas cases. The Gitmo detainees already enjoy unlimited access to attorneys and are able to take full advantage of the federal courts. We do not need to create yet another layer of review so that their lawyers can drag the government through endless litigation during this time of war. Our legislation allows detainees to have a personal representative for periodic reviews, and that is consistent with the Geneva Conventions and our current handling of the detainees in Afghanistan. We also have several concerns with the role of the Department of Justice. Our military and intelligence community, not the Department of Justice, should be leading our law of war detention and intelligence gathering efforts. The Department of Justice should not be involved in determining the national security threat an individual poses to the United States or their potential intelligence value. Our legislation provides for a panel of military officers with expertise in operation, intelligence, and counterterrorism to make related to the law of war detention. I also mentioned as a former member of the Army JAG Corps, as well as my colleague here, we have an amazing group of people, as was mentioned sort of earlier, that represent military legal community, and that's both prosecutors and defense. And one of the things that hopefully that we can come away with today is that the rule of law and due process it would have the utmost respect and due diligence when it comes to the men and women who wear the uniform, but also swear to uphold and defend the Constitution and our rules of law. So thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Bobby Schilling. I represent the Illinois 17th District, which borders the Thompson Prison Facility. First, I would like to thank Chairman McKeon for putting together the Congressional Task Force on Gitmo. As was mentioned, the President took unilateral action without consulting Congress on how to deal with the remaining terrorists in Gitmo. I find this totally unacceptable. And first of all, what I really want to do is thank the American people for the votes that allowed us 87 new freshmen to become members of Congress and basically ensure that Gitmo will remain closed to the terrorists. And then also that we make sure that we handle these folks through the military tribunals. I'm working with Chairman McKeon to introduce this legislation that will handle the detainees and specifically stop funding for the construction or modification of any facilities inside the United States to house Gitmo detainees. In other words, this legislation would mean no detainees in Thompson, Illinois, or anywhere in the United States, its territories or possessions, except for in Guantanamo Bay. So I visited Gitmo, and it's a pretty nice facility. There was always one of the things I always asked during the campaign is the fact that is number one is why are we closing Gitmo? And then will it make America any safer by bringing some of the world's most terrible people here? And I was unable to get a response to that. But I'm confident that this bill will ensure that these terrorists will be dealt with in the best interest of the United States. Thank you.
Tim Griffin from Arkansas 2. I am currently serving as a JAG officer in the Army Reserve, but I do not speak for the Army here today. But I speak in favor of this legislation. A critical part of what is going on down at Gitmo and in law of war detention is not just to detain the individuals, but to collect intelligence that can help keep America safe. And the criminal justice system does not allow us to fully obtain the intelligence that we might gather through the intelligence procedures under the law of war. This legislation will require military custody of individuals who can be detained under the law of war to make sure that we are getting the information that we need to keep Americans safe. Obviously, the threats that we're facing today have no borders. We are at war. We must continue to take the fight to the enemy overseas, wherever we may find them. But as we've seen, the enemy is trying their best to get to us here in the United States. We need to be prepared for that, and our legislation is a recognition and the first step in reprioritizing intelligence gathering over traditional law enforcement, and that is a critical distinction. We have included a waiver in this legislation that allows the Secretary of Defense to determine that someone that could be held under the law of war, that they should go into the criminal justice system. But the default is that these individuals should be brought into a system where the law of war governs. They're in military custody, and being in military custody will allow for continuous and comprehensive intelligence gathering. They won't have to immediately go to a judge, for example, as they would have to in the civilian or in the criminal justice world. They don't get Miranda rights read to them. It is a different construct under the law of war that recognizes the difference between war and evidence gathering on the streets of an American city. Thank you.